Today is May the 4th, and this day in Baptist history is entitled, Is There Anything to Baby Dedication? And the scripture reading is from 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 12 through 28. Just let me read verses 10 and 11, and then we'll go up to verse 19 through 28. 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 10, And she, Hannah, was in bitterness of soul, and prayed unto the Lord, and wept sore. And she vowed a vow, and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but wilt give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. Verse 19. And they rose up in the morning early, and worshipped before the Lord, and returned and came to their house to Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come about after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, Because I have asked him of the Lord. And the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever. And Elkanah her husband said unto her, Do what seemeth thee good. Tarry until thou have weaned him. Only the Lord establish his word. So the woman abode, and gave her son suck until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, with 3 bullocks, and 1 ephah of flour, and a bottle of wine, and brought him unto the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young. And they slew a bullock, and brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here praying unto the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my petition, which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he worshipped the Lord there. It was May 4, 1840, in the little town of Attleboro, Massachusetts, when Mr. and Mrs. Alphaeus Cushing were blessed with the birth of a son, Josiah Nelson Cushing. The parents were not affluent, as this world counts wealth, but they rejoiced in the goodness of God to them, and dedicated their little son to follow and serve the Lord. Fortunately, the Cushings lived near the Baptist church house, and they were faithful followers of the Lamb. As Josiah matured, he showed a love for good literature, and his pastor opened his library to the youth. Josiah, as a teenager, realized his need for personal salvation, and during evangelistic meetings he was born again. Josiah determined to be faithful unto death, and at his 16th birthday he was baptized in obedience to the Lord's command. The Cushings were not able to provide extensive educational opportunities, and Josiah found employment as a teacher at the age of 16. As money became available, the young man pursued his own education at the Pierce Academy, 20 miles from home. However, when his funds were exhausted, it was necessary to drop out of the school. His parents encouraged him to continue his education, and in the fall of 1858 he was able to enter Brown University. During his freshman year, Josiah felt the call of God, and writing home, he informed his parents of his goal of entering the ministry. After the completion of his college training, Josiah went on to study at Newton Theological Seminary. Though desirous of serving the Lord, Josiah had no burden for missions until he heard a missionary on furlough present the need of the work in Burma. Soon after, he wrote in his diary, Have I a call to go forth as a foreign missionary? O Lord, if thou hast called me, make me ready to take up my cross. Let thy will be done. In May of 1865, Josiah applied for missionary service in Burma. He was heartily accepted and began to intently make arrangements. This was, of course, at the conclusion of the Great Civil War, and many complications had to be cared for. During the course of preparation, Josiah met a young widow, Mrs. Ellen H. Fairfield. Her husband had drowned, and she was directing the work of an orphanage. Following a short engagement, the couple was married. The Cushing sailed for Burma with 6 other missionaries, arriving in Rangoon on March 11, 1867. The young couple was assigned to the field of responsibility containing 7 million nominal Buddhist Shans who lived in northeastern Burma. With no dictionary or book of grammar to help in their study, the Cushing set out to conquer the language. Josiah's linguistic abilities were remarkable, and in his first year he was able to translate a hymn into the Shan language and begin work on a Shan English dictionary. So that the work might extend through the mountain tribes and on to the border of western China, Cushing journeyed to Mandalay, the Burmese capital, for an audience with the king. He was granted not only a royal decree to travel in the land of the Shans, but also permission to preach and distribute gospel literature. However, the physical problems of Mrs. Cushing made it necessary for her to remain in Rangoon, and for the next few years their ministry was confined to that area. In 1869, a church was organized in Rangoon. Josiah's desire was to establish a strong base in the heart of the Shan country. For this reason, he made several tours into territory that missionaries had never visited. He used every opportunity to preach the gospel where it had never been declared previously. For reasons of health, the Cushings had to return to the States in 1875, but in June of 1876 they returned to Burma. The work proliferated as the Cushings went to Bhamo, a city on the northern border of the land of the Shans, to establish the work. The city had been selected because of its strategic location. Baptists of America sent recruits to assist in a great spiritual harvest, but the grim reaper took a heavy toll. It seemed that every year death claimed another missionary, but Josiah continued in the work. The time came when Josiah was informed by a doctor that Mrs. Cushing would have to return to America for surgery and treatment. After agonizing in prayer, it was determined that Josiah would remain on the field as Mrs. Cushing returned to the States. In August of 1880, Mrs. Cushing sailed away, and the long, lonesome days drove Josiah as never before into the work of translating the Scriptures. He completed the Shan New Testament on November 23, 1880. In acknowledgement of this great accomplishment, Josiah's alma mater, Brown University, honored its illustrious graduate with a Doctor of Divinity degree in 1881. The dear missionary persisted in the task of translating the Old Testament as well. Finally, on January 13, 1885, he completed the entire project. It was now time for the Cushings to be reunited, and Josiah returned to the States in the spring of the year to once again be with his wife. It was evident that Mrs. Cushing was still not able to return to the rigorous life of Burma, and Josiah returned alone to the field in August of 1886. It was apparent to all that due to his age, the great missionary could not continue in pioneering work. With a desperate need to train nationals for the work of the ministry, the mission board asked Dr. Cushing to assume the position of president of the Rangoon Baptist College. During his tenure, the college experienced great growth, growing from 122 students in 1892 to an enrollment of 438 in 1896. The need for continued growth in the college caused Dr. Cushing to plan to return to America on furlough to solicit the needed funds. He left Burma in February of 1905, arriving in the States just before his 65th birthday. He was reunited with his dear wife, and they sought rest in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The annual meetings of the Missionary Union were held in St. Louis, Missouri in May of that year, and the Cushings attended. It was also in St. Louis that Dr. Cushing had been appointed in 1865. For the past 40 years he had served the Lord in Burma. What a grand occasion was planned. Little did they realize that in the very midst of the meetings, Dr. Cushing would be called home to glory. On May 17, 1905, between sessions of the mission meetings, the Lord called his servant unto himself. Dr. A.C. Dixon led in prayer as the messengers of the convention sat in shocked silence. The Missionary Union adopted the following resolution in recognition of the labor of Dr. Cushing, and I quote, "An evangelist, a translator, a traveler, an educator, a scholar, a preacher. It was fitting that so noble and devoted a life should have a glorious termination. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, he was not, for God took him. Swift was his translation, speedy his glorious coronation." End of quote. How important was that prayer of dedication by a humble couple on May 4, 1880, as they dedicated their little newborn son to the Lord. May God raise up a host of surrendered Christian couples who will follow that example in our day. To God be the glory.